Good afternoon, everybody, if you're in the UK. Good morning if you're in the US. I am Brendan O'Malley, Editor-in-Chief of University World News, the respected global online higher education publication. Welcome to our webinar on trends in AI for student assessment, where we offer higher education, academics, staff and organizations the opportunity to learn from and question leading experts on the topic. Generative AI has taken higher education by storm in the past 2 years, evolving and spreading at such a rate that it is difficult for academics and staff with heavy workloads to keep up with the developing technology and its burgeoning range of tools. Student assessment is an area that is being profoundly affected by generative AI. This is the first in a series of webinars being held in partnership with ABET, the United States-based but globally operating non-profit quality assurance and accreditation agency in the STEM fields. Before I introduce you to our experts, we would be grateful if you could complete the first of our audience polls. You should be able to see them on your screen if you go to the interaction section, and this will allow us to get a feel for who is watching today. So please could you let us know whether you are a senior university leader, senior academic, university administrator, student, policymaker, or none of the above. And we'll give you the results shortly. Now, I want you to know that if at any time during the discussion you have questions, please type them in the chat window. We will get to some of your questions towards the end of the session. This webinar has been scheduled for 90 minutes. In case audience question time runs a little over the 1 hour planned duration. A recording of the webinar will be available. University World News will send this out by email to everyone who registered for the webinar. The recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. Just search for University World News on YouTube and you'll find it there. Now, let me introduce you to our expert speakers who come at the topic of trends in AI for student assessment from different angles. One from teaching and learning, one from the area of program assessment, one from the technology and the intelligence field. Now, our first speaker I want to introduce is Dr. Nigel Francis. Good afternoon, Nigel. Nigel teaches immunology and is the digital education lead for the School of Biosciences at Cardiff University in the UK. He explores ways to ensure that students learn to use generative AI appropriately and ethically to enhance their educational experience. He is an award-winning educator, having won the British Society for Immunology Teaching Excellence Award and the Royal Society of Biology's Higher Education Teacher of the Year Award. He is a National Teaching Fellow and Principal Fellow of Advance HE. Our second guest today is Dr. Gloria Rogers. Good morning, Gloria. Gloria is the Senior Adjunct Director. Good morning, Gloria. We lost you there. Gloria is the Senior Adjunct Director for Professional Offerings at ABET and an Assessment and Data Analyst at Indiana State University in the US. Good morning from the US, Gloria. Gloria is a highly experienced speaker on continuous quality improvement in higher education programs and an external evaluator, and has served on numerous national advisory committees and review panels for the National Science Foundation. Gloria has been exploring ways that generative AI can supplement the work that needs to be done for the assessment of academic programs. Our third guest, I hope he's here, is Dr. Craig Kaplan. Craig is CEO of IQ Company, a consulting company in California that he founded in 1993, and which is focused on artificial general intelligence, AGI, and superintelligence. I think we're still waiting for Craig to join us, so I'll carry on introducing him. Craig helped pioneer the field of online surveys in the 1990s and was involved in early efforts to develop some of the first computer-based tutors at Carnegie Mellon University in the 1980s. And currently his focus is on designing safe AGI and superintelligent systems based on the collaboration of many AI agents. Now, while we're waiting for Craig to arrive, we have the results of our first poll, which I'll outline to you. So we can just see that we have 13% senior academic leaders, 13% senior university leaders, 23% senior academic, 28% academics, 14% university administrators, 3% students, 5% policymakers, and 15% who say they are none of the above. So I think we'll move to our first question. Hopefully Craig will join us. To begin with, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to introduce us to their work as it relates to generative AI in student assessment and some possible implications for learning and for higher education. And Nigel and Gloria are reporting from the coal face of using generative AI in assessment, while Craig will explore the field of technology and intelligence more broadly. So Nigel, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. So yeah, I'm the digital education lead for the School of Biosciences at Cardiff University. I've been, I would say, quite an early adopter of technology in teaching as it's come about. So I started using videos in my teaching way before we were forced to during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so generative AI has really been an aspect of my role as digital education lead I've been trying to get to grips with. I wouldn't describe myself as an expert in AI. I would describe myself as more of an enthusiastic amateur who enjoys playing around with it and seeing what the capabilities of the tools are. I'm coming from it very much from the assessment integrity angle and thinking about ways that we can work with the technology to ensure that we can embed it effectively and make sure that our students are learning with AI rather than using it to offload a lot of their learning. And so we try to create assessments and ways of ensuring that the students can demonstrate what they do know at program levels, which leads into what Gloria is going to be touching on.
Gloria, would you like to tell us about your work?
Yes, thank you. I come at it from a practitioner point of view, working with both national and programmatic accreditation agencies that require academic programs, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, about the nature of academic programs, but being able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the program, whereas in the classroom we kind of focus on individual students. So my work has been to actually work with faculty in many of the ways that it sounds like Nigel is working with a class in the course and with students. And that is, how do you use AI to effectively produce results that will support the integrity of the program? In other words, our programs demonstrating that students are attaining the competencies or the student learning outcomes that they have indicated are important for that program. So that's my focus right now is kind of exploring at the program level what students know or can do in the use of AI.
Thank you, Gloria. And we don't seem to have Craig with us yet. So before we continue our discussion, I'm going to ask you all to complete our second audience poll, and let us know, what we want to know is, have you used a large language model, an LLM, for your work, such as GPT, Claude, or Llama? Give you time to answer that question. I'll move on to our second question to our panelists. Nigel, you're interested in process versus product assessment, process versus outcome, if you like. But does the end product matter, or is the process by which students reach the product becoming more important to assess?
I think the process has always been important because that's how the students are able to demonstrate that they have cognitively engaged with the material. I think what's changed dramatically in the last couple of years is that we cannot with any certainty guarantee how much of a product is AI generated and how much is human generated. And I think as the technology evolves, it's going to become even harder to determine where AI starts and where humans start. So with the process versus product assessment, it's really about trying to ensure that the students are able to evidence the process they've gone through in order to validate information. So we all know that these AI models are not perfect. They make mistakes, they hallucinate. And so for me as an academic, I really want to make sure that the students are able to critically analyze those outputs and to be able to evidence where they found that information from. So it's not just about taking an AI output and putting it into a piece of work, rewording it. It's about looking at it very, very critically and then going away and finding additional peer-reviewed sources that support what the AI has said. And that iterative process of going away, finding that additional information and then redrafting what you've written, that's really, I think, the key thing that we need to start thinking about assessing, rather than how good an essay is in our opinion. That process trail of making sure that we evidence how we've used not just AI, but search engines, databases, and making sure that we can evidence how we got to that end product. And what we're really seeing is that the more that students engage with this process trail, the better the end product is anyway. There's a correlation between the two. And so I think it's a win-win all round in terms of trying to introduce an element of robustness to AI, but also asking students to use it ethically and appropriately within an assessment, and then the actual final product that the students have to take away at the end of it being of a higher quality as well.
You mentioned, sorry, Nigel, you mentioned hallucinations. Could you explain what that is? And could you explain a bit about what challenges you face in trying to track the process that they're following?
Yeah, sure. So hallucinations essentially means that the information that the large language model produces has been made up. So an example of that might be that you ask it to analyze some data for you and to provide a supporting piece of literature which is being peer reviewed as a reference, and it will make that reference up potentially. It might have some elements of the reference which are plausible, like the authors or the actual title of the paper, but it might make mistakes on which journal it's been published in, which year it's been published in, things like that. So these models don't have knowledge as we understand it as humans. They are predictive models, whereby the next word or part of a word is statistically chosen based on what the model has been trained on. So it can make these mistakes. And so what we can see sometimes in assessments, if students haven't gone away and really critically analysed those outputs and fact checked them, is that as experts in the field that they are writing about, we can pick up on those mistakes quite quickly and those misconceptions. And so students have to be very careful to make sure that they do go away and provide additional sources to actually validate the information. And that's something that they should be doing anyway. It's not just an AI thing. That's really what we are assessing as a competency in a student anyway, is that critical thinking, that ability to find sources, and that ability to write. And so I think that's really what I'm trying to come across from that sort of process perspective. Does that answer your question, Brendan?
Yes. I mean, do you have any particular tips on how you track the process in a
Yeah, so we've done process trails whereby we actually ask students to fill in a pro forma which details how they've used the tool. So it will say what tool they have used, it will ask them for the prompt that they have used, and it will ask them then for any iterations on that prompt. So how have they engaged with that output from that? How have they refined the prompts? You can do that also outside of the AI space with public databases like Scopus, Web of Science. So you can ask, okay, so what was your initial search term? How did you then narrow down from however many thousand of papers that your first term produced to something that was more manageable for your literature review? And so what you're really doing is you're looking at how the students are getting to a source of material that they can engage with and that they can use effectively within their work. And I've got some resources that we're more happy to share if people would like.
That would be very helpful. Now, Gloria, I know you wanted to talk about whether academics are using AI for program level assessment. And if they are, how are they doing this? And it might be helpful if if you explain what you mean by program level, because this can be seen interpreted differently in different countries.
All right, we'll start there. I'd like to make a distinction. I have a couple of slides that kind of demonstrate the difference, and I would like to make a distinction between course or classroom assessment and program assessment. So those slides. Thank you, Liam. Okay, so we have for course assessment. We all understand how to put together a curriculum for a specific discipline. For example, let's say this is a general business major, for example, and that there are certain courses that students have to take. And Nigel's talking about within those courses, we have a responsibility to not only make sure that students understand what's expected of them, but that our processes have integrity to them, and that we can give students the kind of feedback that they need in terms of that course. So and all that assessment takes place in individual course assessment. But instructors have a distinct role in course assessment as well. We can go to the next slide, thank you. And that is that course instructors are content experts and facilitators of learning. That is their primary role in an individual course. And so the use of AI to help create syllabi, to help with assessments are really important. But now we're talking about program assessment, right? We're looking at the program as a whole. We're trying to answer the question, can the program, when I talk about program again, I'm talking about, for example, a psychology program, a history program, a general business program, a electrical engineering program. Can the program demonstrate that by the time the students complete the program, that they have attained certain knowledge and skills, okay? So now we're looking at the program as a whole. And as a result of that, the faculty have an additional role. In addition to content expert and facilitator of learning, they have a role as a member of a learning community. Faculty learning together about whether or not students are able to demonstrate by the end of the program. Now we would call that summative assessment, right? By the end of the program, can students demonstrate their particular knowledge and skills? And this, for the program, in a quality improvement process, and that's really what we're talking about. Why do we care, right? Well, we want to know if students cannot demonstrate those things, then we need to do something to improve the program. And it may be individual courses, it may be course sequences, it may be integrating additional modules, whatever it takes to ensure that our students are getting the kinds of opportunities to learn, practice, develop, and demonstrate over time their ability to demonstrate those outcomes. So it's really important to understand that when we're talking about program assessment, at least when I talk about program assessment, I'm talking about the program as a whole and not individual pieces. So I would call that a high stakes assessment. And Nigel, you might want to address this too. They're using AI in certain ways, for example, to help us create processes, which is different than assessing student learning, right? Some of those are high stakes assessment because at the program level, the data that we gather, that we find, and we're going to identify strengths and weaknesses in student learning. Then as a program, we have to make decisions about what we need to do to ensure that we can improve student learning over time. And those would be high stakes assessment for the program, because now you're asking faculty to invest time and effort in making those decisions and evaluating those results. And so the quality of that output that Nigel's talking about is really important, because I think it's interesting that when using ChatGPT, one of the things that comes up is the notion of it's actually on the program itself. The ChatGPT can make mistakes. It says check important information. So the question becomes, what's important information? And if it's a high stakes process, it's all important. And I'm actually trying to use this in my own work, and I'm finding that for some processes, it doesn't do very well. Qualitative analysis, for example. And some of that is honing my own skills for developing prompts. So I actually have done qualitative analysis by hand, and also then used it in Chat GPT, and the results are very different. And so I think it's really important that we take this seriously, because somebody is going to act on the results of what we're gathering for Chat GPT or any of the processes that we use. So that's my biggest concern. And whether or not people are using it, absolutely they're using it. I have my data is all anecdotal, talking to people at conferences where I'm making presentations, getting input from people in the gallery about how they're using it, and they are using it. Now, whether or not they're using it widely, and one of the things I like to talk about is moving from artificial intelligence to human intelligence. All right. So the idea that we have to keep in mind is this is artificial intelligence. So what are the important questions that we have to ask to know whether or not what the output is meeting the needs that we have for our programs? I'm sorry, Brendan, that was probably more than 3 minutes.
No, that was that was very useful. I mean, somebody from the Nigel, did you want to come back on that? I mean, in particular, I'm wondering, does what Gloria says, talking about in terms of programs, affect how how we have a discussion? I mean, should we be having a discussion about how you reach competency-based assessment, because it's such a difficult thing to do, and what tools do you use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what really resonates with me from what Gloria said is that by the end of a degree program, we have to be able to say this is what a graduate can do when they graduate from our university and go out into the working world. And we as educators, as institutions, have an obligation to make sure that the students that we graduate do have those proficiencies. And I think what Gloria is talking about there in terms of having those different types of assessments, we really need to have a very rich assessment diet, so different types of assessment modalities to ensure that we are hitting those learning outcomes from as many different angles as possible to ensure that students can evidence what they're doing. And what you touched on there, Brendan, in terms of the competency-based assessment, I'm a really big believer that assessment is what a student can do and not what they can remember or know. Ultimately, almost all of us have got a smartphone in our pocket with access to the internet. So if we don't remember something, we can look it up very easily. It's not a case of we have to go to a dusty old library and hunt through textbooks or papers to find that information anymore. So the way that we consume knowledge and the way that we find knowledge is very, very different. But what we do with that knowledge is what I think we really need to be assessing for our student cohorts now, and how well they can do that. And I think the challenge from a program level and from course level is, what is competent? Where do we draw that line of, well, you are now deemed competent in a certain skill or a certain element of the course? I think that's the real challenge that we have to grapple with over the coming years.
And is one of the problems that there's an additional problem that's coming up from our viewers actually about, how do you know when the tools that you're using with AI, how do you know what their weaknesses are? Do we know, what the common mistakes are, for instance, that they make, so that we can be wary of them? How do you take that into account in what you do? Perhaps Gloria, perhaps you could answer that one.
Yeah, and I actually have a couple more slides that might help to answer that question. And I think one of the things around competencies is to actually know and to let students know exactly what we expect of them around those competencies. And I refer to the outcomes as a broader area, like critical thinking would be, right? But then how are we going to define, what are we going to look for as evidence that a student can think critically? And I found that ChatGPT can be very helpful with that. And I call it the AI filter, moving from artificial intelligence to the program level output, which is human intelligence, and trying to help faculty to think about what kinds of questions they should ask. And I have found that for the performance indicators, and again, by performance indicator, I mean what are the performances that we're going to look for that indicate that the student is attaining that competency, right? So the first question is that they should ask themselves is, are the program indicators appropriate for the program? Because ChatGPT does a great job of producing those performance indicators. You tell them how many you want, you tell them what the competency is, and it'll generate a bunch of them. But the question becomes, are they appropriate for your individual program? That's the first question you should ask. And is there only one performance in each indicator? In other words, it doesn't have a whole string of things with commas and ands where you have really multiple performances in one indicator. Another one would be, are they at the right domain level? And Nigel, I think you mentioned, do they have to know it, or do they have to create something, or is it an analysis? At what level do they have to demonstrate? And is it the appropriate level for your program? Okay. The other one is, what is missing that's important to the program? Just because ChatGPT generates 8 performance indicators, of which you're going to choose 4, there might be some that are missing that you think are really important for your program. So that's an important question to ask. Another one is, are the performance indicators discipline specific? In other words, are they specific to an immunology program or a psychology program or a business program? So are they discipline specific? And then it says, or should they be? Is critical thinking no matter what program it's in? Those are kinds of questions faculty need to ask themselves. And another one is, how many performance indicators do you need to have confidence that the students are attaining the student outcomes? A lot of people call these key performance indicators, KIPs, key performance indicators, because obviously we're not going to measure every possible thing that a student learns in their years in the discipline, right? So what are those high-level key things that we're going to look for that are indicators? So that would be an example of the kinds of questions faculty should ask. Another one relates to scoring rubrics. A lot of people use scoring rubrics. We use them a lot at the program level. And it's the same thing. I'm going to tell you, ChatGPT does a pretty good job of creating rubrics if you give it the performance indicators that make up that rubric. Okay, you have to tell it how many points on the scale. You've got to tell it a lot of give instructions, but it does a fairly good job. I'd give it 3.5 stars out of 5 for creating rubrics. But is the content area consistent with the description? So there's a whole series of questions. I'm not going to read them all to you, but so it's like helping faculty understand that, frankly, ChatGPT isn't going to replace faculty effort. What ChatGPT is doing, I believe, and I'm seeing this, is reduces the amount of busy work that faculty do and gets them into more of the critical thinking and analysis of the output of ChatGPT to make it appropriate to their program. So we're really asking faculty to use their time more wisely, and I'm optimistic that if we can continue, and at ABET we've just started this process in guiding programs on how to use ChatGPT responsibly, but it's going to be interesting to see how we can develop not only helping them to create efficient prompts, but also helping them to analyze the output that comes from it.
Thank you, thank you, Gloria. So I think now we will just take a moment to look at the answer to our second poll, which was asking people, have you used a large language model for your work? And the answer was 52% yes, it's part of my workflow. 30% said once or twice, and only 18% said no. So it's very much part of academic life now. So we actually have a third poll question that we're going to ask you, which is, what are the main challenges you face in using generative AI for assessment? And it gives you a whole load of choices, ensuring fairness and reducing bias in AI-based assessments, verifying the accuracy and validity of AI-generated results, lack of training or expertise in using Gen AI tools, addressing ethical concerns, protecting student data, privacy and security, difficulty integrating AI tools with current assessment systems, resistance to adopting AI-driven assessment, or I do not face significant challenges. So whilst you're answering that, we will carry on to our third question, which is, we sort of started answering this, but Nigel, what do you think are the main challenges to incorporating generative AI into education, in particular assessment?
That's a very broad question. I think the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is just the sheer speed in which the sector is evolving, and the capability of the tools is increasing exponentially. And so there was a question, I think, in the chat about sort of what tools would we recommend for these types of work. And I'm very reticent to recommend any individual tools because they change so quickly and the capabilities move so fast. So a tool I recommend today might be obsolete by next week because something else has superseded it. And so I think really it's about playing around with offerings and seeing what works for you and what produces the best outcomes for you in your particular contexts. In terms of actually incorporating AI into assessment, I think it's really about trying to educate our students how to use these tools in a transparent manner and in an ethical manner, so that it really helps to support their learning rather than allowing them to offload part of the learning to the tool. So I think one of the key ways I try to illustrate this to my students is if I asked an AI tool to produce 10 multiple choice questions on my topic, I can skim through that incredibly quickly and go, yes, 7 out of those 10 questions make sense because I understand and I have that base level of understanding and knowledge in my field. Whereas a student is going to take a lot longer to do that because they have to fact check every single one of the questions and the answers to see whether or not it makes sense. So AI isn't a shortcut. We still need to have students with that base level of understanding and ability to critique that knowledge that they gain in their discipline, to then take an AI output and use it in an effective manner. And I think where we're struggling at the moment is that there are a large number of institutions around the world that do not have really clear AI assessment guidelines. They do not tell their students what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so students are quite fearful sometimes actually in the discussions that I have about using AI because they don't know where that line is. So what can I do with an AI tool and I won't get pulled up for unfair practice or academic integrity issues? Where is that line? Where do I cross it? And so I think we really need to be quite clear now about the way that AI can be used within assessments. And that's going to change from different assessments. So you might have an in-class assessment and AI cannot be used in that at all because it's invigilated. You might have a particular type of assessment where you would advise the students that they can use AI in particular ways. And then you may have assessments where AI can be embedded and used in any way that you like. But I think the cautionary tale with that, I would say, is that a lot of these tools have premium versions, which you can pay for. And the outputs that you get from those premium versions are much, much higher in terms of the quality of the answers than you get from the free versions. And so if you are going to use AI in any kinds of assessments, I think you need to make sure that you are providing access to a premium version of that tool for all of your students. Otherwise, you're going to disadvantage those that can't afford to pay for it. So that would be the cautionary tale on that. But I think it's going to be an evolving question over the next few years of how we best embed AI and allow AI to be used to really enhance the student learning journey as opposed to replacing it.
Thank you, Nigel. And Gloria, I think you have been telling us a bit about how academics are using AI, but you may want to go into more depth on that, but also talk about the ethical considerations and the problems that it causes.
I'm sorry, did you address that to me, Brendan?
Yes, Gloria, sorry, yes. Nigel has been talking about the use of AI with students, but perhaps you could talk a bit about how it's being used with academics and the ethical questions that are arising from that.
Well, I think there's the same issues that we have in the classroom with students are the same issues we have with faculty and the instructors who are using it. Whether or not they're using it ethically and whether they're disadvantaging some students in the way in which they're using it, and also confidentiality of information. We've got to be very careful about what we put in terms of student information into the prompts. If we embed a spreadsheet or something that has confidential data, and there are ways to protect it for that, but faculty have to know how to do that. So it's always a concern, right? And whether or not the critical difference, I think, between classroom assessment and program assessment is that in the classroom, it's a high stakes assessment for those individual students, right? Because eventually all of this will end up with a grade or some kind of a mechanism to evaluate what they know or can do. So course assessment is how is the student doing, where program assessment says how is the program doing. So the assessment is of the program, not individual students. And so that difference, it makes a difference in terms of how we approach that as well. And I think the lack of guidelines for how students use and should use and can use, at some institutions it's up to each faculty member. So students may have, if they're taking 4 or 5 courses, they may have 4 or 5 different kinds of constraints and requirements on the use of chat GPTs or the generative AI. So that becomes problematic as well. So I think it has to be, as a program produces its results and its processes, because program assessment doesn't just involve the results, it involves the processes as well. What were the scoring rubrics were used? Where were they generated? How did you get them? How are they consistent with your competencies? All of those kinds of questions need to be answered. So it's very important that we take that into consideration. But it's going to take a while because things are moving so rapidly, as Nigel said. I gave a presentation a year ago based upon what I knew then, and what I know now is very different, right? So it's just really important to understand that we're chasing it. That's for sure. And I think people are making some promises they can't keep about the potential effectiveness of the use of generative AI as well. We're now talking about, what is it, ASI, is it, or AGI, is it, where it's actually going to be able to think and critically think and be more comparable to the thought process of a human than just artificial intelligence as a whole. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how it all pans out.
Well, thank you. And we have a question, well, a comment really from the audience that I'll just drop in now, but from Sonia, who says, following my experimentation with ChatGPT, I observed that it operates with a cumulative and associative logic, enabling it to, sorry, we've lost the thread of that one. Let me just, sorry, beg your pardon. Enabling it to provide non-global interactive evaluations. What do you think? It operates with the cumulative and associative logic, enabling it to provide non-global interactive evaluations. Would either of you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on that. I think what we really need to appreciate is that these tools are statistical models. They don't have knowledge, they don't have understanding, and they have been trained on the internet. So Wikipedia has been scraped, Reddit has been scraped, a lot of copyrighted material from publishers has been scraped. And so the quality of the data that these models have been trained on is very, very variable. And it's been cleansed by workers in Africa in particular to remove a lot of the harmful content from it. but it does still present a very white, westernized, male-dominated perspective on a lot of matters, because that's what a large body of the literature that's been trained on is saying. And so if you only prompt GPT at a basic level and ask it to give you an output, it can be incredibly biased in its output. There are ways that you can prompt it more effectively, to ask it to address certain cultural biases, or to ask it to address gender biases within an answer. But fundamentally, yes, it is a non-global and very white male-dominated output that you are going to see from these models, unless you specifically ask it to address those issues. I don't know if, Gloria, if you've got anything you'd add to that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that what happens is, and I know there have been times when I have used it, when I've been very disappointed in the output. I've asked it some things I actually knew the answers to, and what happens is that you lose confidence in ChatGPT or any of the AI tools to produce valid and reliable responses. And I think then to continue to use it without applying the human intelligence piece to it, I think is going to be a real problematic. I think it's going to take us down a path we don't want to go. But this is what we tell our students, right? Just because I can remember when the internet first came around, kids say, "Oh, you can't trust everything that's out on the internet." We tell students that today. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it's true or valid or reliable, right? It's the same thing with ChatGPT. We've got to learn how to be critical thinkers around what the tool is capable of. And Nigel, it may be a part of that. May be just what you said. That a lot of people don't even understand where all that comes from. The fact that it's the biases that it has and those kinds of things. Be real careful about how we use it.
And isn't this actually a useful learning exercise for students to actually set them on case studies and looking up information provided by ChatGPT, just as it would be with Wikipedia, and working out, collaboratively, perhaps collaboratively, be interesting to have a project where students worked collaboratively across the world to look at a certain piece of knowledge provided by ChatGPT to see how it is biased and how it is misleading what other knowledge, how it could be corrected. And I think there's a case of that in one of Kathy Davidson's books, where she writes about the new education, and they actually do that sort of exercise. They must have been doing it before ChatGPT was invented, but at CUNY in New York, and that so there's an element of using the very weakness of AI as a basis for learning.
Involved as well. I think that concerns me a little bit. Where we produce work that's been generated primarily by ChatGPT or again any of the AI tools, and don't acknowledge that fact. And I just saw this happen recently in a high school graduation, a valedictorian speech. And the student just did a beautiful job, and afterwards, my colleague said to her, "That was really great." She said, ChatGPT. I mean, just like, and these are, 17, 18-year-olds, and they're going into universities with that same attitude that then we've got an uphill battle to just be so freely to admit that it was all generated by ChatGPT. It was a little frightening.
I think that really highlights a major key point, is that as people become more used to using these tools, and 16, 17, 18-year-olds are clearly using this a lot more than we are, they're going to gain lots and lots of knowledge of how to use it. It's going to become part of their everyday life. And so I think really from an educator perspective, we need to teach our students that being transparent about the usage of these tools is really important, because that's how we're going to make sure that it doesn't become this sort of taboo underground technology that has to be hidden from academics. And that's not what it should be about. It should be about being openly, embracing the technology and learning to work with it, and just being really open and honest about how you've used it to do things.
Thank you. So now I think it's good time now to look at the results of our third poll, which was what are the main challenges you face in using Gen AI for assessment? And 30% said ensuring fairness and reducing bias in AI-based assessment. 53% said verifying the accuracy and validity of AI-generated results. 49% said lack of training or expertise in using Gen AI tools. I think that's a really important point. What training is there for academics and for students? 41% addressing ethical concerns was a big problem. 25% said protecting student data privacy and security. And 45% said integrating AI tools with current assessment systems. 19% said resistance to adopting AI-driven assessment. And only 6% said, I do not face significant challenges. Excuse me. Well, that's interesting because that does show quite a broad range of challenges and ethical concerns, and interesting about the quite a high need for training. So now let's look at our fourth poll, which is on a different question. I was waiting for it to come up. I think the question is, are you familiar with the topic of AI agents? And it's a simple yes or no, multiple choice. So if everyone could fill that in, and we'll move to our fourth question, which is, let's ask a controversial question of Nigel, which is, will generative AI replace human educators?
I hope not. No, I don't think in the short term it will. And the reason I say that is based on experience of teaching through the pandemic, and students were craving interaction with human educators. They moved everything online in a vast majority of institutions, and it wasn't a great learning experience for students. And I think when we start thinking about the way that our students interact with us as educators and the way that they interact with technology at this point in time, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. We have dealt with disruptive technologies in education before. So the internet was going to ruin education. I think it was Plato that said that books were going to be the end of education, which ironically he was writing in a book at the same time about that. Education before, and we found ways to adapt and to embrace them. And I think AI is going to be the same. I think it's going to be a technology and a tool that we need to learn how to use effectively, that our students need to learn effectively, because they are clearly going to use it when they graduate. But I think there will always be an element of humanity in education, because these tools at this point in time do not have human level intelligence. They do not have human level creativity, and they certainly don't have human level empathy. They couldn't counsel the student that comes to my office in tears because they failed an assessment and they don't know what to do with it. So I think there's a very, very long way to go before we're on that point where an AI can replace a human educator.
Thank you, Nigel. Gloria, could you give us some examples of how AI can be used for assessment processes and to help analyze results?
Yeah, I think that it does a really pretty good job, as I mentioned earlier, of helping us to refine what our competencies are. We have to remember that we're talking about programs. You can have two programs with the same name at two different institutions, and their competencies will be different because the students are different, the faculty are different, where they go after they complete the program are different. So giving each program a chance to be unique in terms of who they are and what they want their students to know as a graduate of their institution or their program. So I think that's really important to remember that can vary from one to the other. And when you think about the processes, the development of your competencies, I think ChatGPT does a pretty good job of giving faculty a head start on creating their list. if they answer all the right questions, right, around the list that's generated. Another one is ChatGPT does a really very good job of creating rubrics. Again, depending upon prompts that were put in and the kinds of directions that were given. There are times when people say, "Well, I'm really discouraged about what I'm getting from AI." But the more you talk with them, the more you recognize the fact that as much of that is the quality of the prompt that is put into the AI tool as the output itself. And so helping a faculty to understand how to write those prompts, and there is, I'm familiar with at least one really pretty nice library of prompts that have been created to help guide people in creating prompts. And I think we're going to see more of those kinds of tools as well. This is a generative AI chatbot prompt library for educators. And it goes into all kinds of areas from administrative to classroom to program. And it gives it examples of prompts and what the output is from that. So I think those kinds of things I think are going to become more available to faculty to help guide them and how to develop those prompts. But certainly that, and the other one is the analysis piece. And I just recently did some analysis on a particular assessment that I did, a summative assessment for the program level. I think there were 45 students in that program at the end of the program, and was able to put that spreadsheet in with an identifier, non-named, just a number identifier of the student, and what their major was, what their minor was, whether they took the course in class or out of class or online, in various categories, and then was able to ask the AI tool to give me the results and doing a comparative analysis of how the students that took the course in class compared their results compared to the students who took them online. So it did a really good job of doing that. So I think that there are some things like that but again, that depends on the faculty member, and they're setting up the spreadsheet, making sure they have all the variables that they need, and then asking the questions and telling them what kinds of analysis it wants it to do. And I think I've been encouraged by what I've seen using that as well. So I think both in the process, developing our processes, as well as doing the analysis, that there's a great deal of potential for working through that with faculty members and programs.
Thank you, Gloria. And Craig was going to talk about AI agents. Would either of you like to comment on AI agents, explain what they are and what they do, and what the issues are there?
Yeah, I can. I mean, this was obviously Craig's area of expertise, but as I understand it, an AI agent is an application or a piece of software which is able to create a self-determining output. So the human guides what the output should be or where it wants the end product to be, but the agent is able to define its own path to get to that end point. I think that's really what the sort of like the latest versions of these AI tools like Gemini 2.0 and ChatGPT 4.01 are really getting to, where they're starting to have an element of reasoning within them so they can self-determine how to solve a problem. I'm not entirely sure exactly what Craig would have spoken about here, but I guess it's probably that as the proficiency of these agents gets better and better, then we are going to be able to offload a lot of tasks to them, so long as we have predetermined what the end goal of the agent is going to be. And so we might sort of be able to figure out new ways of doing things because the agents will be able to track a new path or a more effective path to an output and an outcome. And that's my understanding. I'm not an expert in that field, but that's what I understand by this.
Does it raise questions about assessment, though? How would it affect assessment? Are you able to speak on that? I mean, don't if you don't feel you don't have the specialist knowledge, but
No, I mean, I don't have the specialist knowledge
No.
of it. I think what it does do, though, is it does really impact on that process. So really, if you can offload that process to an AI agent, then we really have to start thinking a little bit more deeply about how we are going to assess the competencies. And that would maybe involve moving assessments to in-person. So I'm not suggesting that everything has to be closed book or open book exams, but doing in-person presentations where the students still have to stand up, present, and defend their arguments, mini vivas, perhaps physical artifact creation, which AI couldn't do. So say a lab book that has to be signed off in a lab class, or a sketch or a drawing or something like that, which is done, physically and delivered physically as an object. So I think it's really going to make us think about what type of assessment modalities that we would value and which ones that we would be able to still use to ensure that our students are meeting those program level outcomes that we are setting them, so when they graduate we can be confident that they have the skills that we say they have.
Thank you. Gloria, would you like to comment on that issue?
Because I certainly don't have any expertise in that area, but the idea of how assessment's been affected, I work with a medical program, and they have actually had remediation for students that didn't reach a certain score, and their remediation was always they had to identify those items that they missed on the exam and write 2 paragraphs around the right answer, what it should be. And they found quickly that students were just throwing it in ChatGPT and just generating it and submitting it. So they had to actually change the way they did remediation because they didn't have the capacity to have an in-class kind of setting. It had to be done out of class. So it is having an impact on how we approach assessment and think about assessment because sometimes we invite students, we make it very easy for them to depend upon some AI tool to generate the answers because it's a high stakes assessment for the student, right? So it's interesting to see how that's going to impact along the way.
Thank you. So thank you for your very interesting answers to all the questions so far. We have some interesting ones coming up from the audience, but I think what we've learned so far is that this situation is really quite fluid, and that there are lots of risks and ethical questions that AI raises, but there are also many benefits that it can have for aiding the assessment of students and programs. But this is a shifting ground, and we could end up in the situation where we have to, you have to bring back in person-to-person questions or vivas and things as part of the assessment because of the way ChatGPT and others are evolving. So this is, and gets back to the question that was already been raised in the polls about, well, how do we make sure that both staff and students are trained and kept up to date in how AI is changing? Because if they're not kept up to date, they won't know some of the problems that they will be facing. And so that's quite a difficult question to ask. And we have got a good question for university leaderships coming up. But first of all, I just want to come back to the result of our final poll, which was, are you familiar with the topic of AI agents, which is one of these new things coming in? And 66% say no. And I must admit I wasn't either. So it just shows you that changes are coming up so quickly, people can't necessarily keep up with them, and you have to plan for that. So we do have a really interesting question, which I'm just trying to locate, so just bear with me a second, which is from Tatiana. Let me just see. Tatiana, when designing and continuously updating a general institutional AI policy, what are the key questions we should be asking ourselves to ensure that students and staff are not afraid to embrace AI? Who'd like to answer that one first? Nigel, I can see you're really enthusiastic.
I think that's a really, really challenging question. And there was another question that kind of links to this in the chat, is about, who trains the people who are creating these policies. I think the biggest challenge is that the competencies of these tools is evolving so fast. It will plateau eventually, I think. We are still in that exponential growth phase of what these tools can do, and hopefully it will slow down, allowing us to catch up a little bit. But I think a lot of institutions are going to have to appoint specialist people to really come up with these policies and to think about them, and take that onus off people like myself, who are just those enthusiastic amateurs who want to play with these tools and explore what they can do, because we very often are seen as the people that are experts in this now. And we're the ones that the institutions turn to and say, well, what do you think about this? And I don't think that's very fair on the people, because we generally aren't experts in this. In terms of the key things, I think that we need to really be thinking about is transparency, and I really like the Sydney model, which has been published fairly recently, which is just 2 lanes. You can't use AI. It's an in-person invigilated assessment, or have at it. And Sydney have said that they will design assessments that can be used alongside AI to support the learning. And I think that's a fantastic attitude to take, and I think that's ultimately where a lot of places will go to. And it's just one of those where we're going to have to constantly update and try to keep abreast as best we can. And that's where I think an institution is going to have to employ somebody whose role it is to try and keep up to date as best they possibly can, or actually probably even a team, because I think it's going to move so quickly.
Gloria, would you like to respond?
Well, no, I jump on what Nigel said about transparency. I think it's important. We don't know what we don't know, right? So encouraging faculty and staff, this is not going to go away. I actually jumped on this because I thought, we can't say, we being the accrediting body, say you can't use ChatGPT, but they're going to use it anyway. So we've got to get ahead of that and say, how should you use it? What's the responsible way to use it? Be transparent in what you're doing. Understand where the data come from. Ask the right questions, because it can be very helpful. And so we've got to get ahead of that. But so in a college or university, number one, you have to understand first, how is it currently being used, right? How are students currently using it? How are faculty and staff using it? And insist upon transparency. When you use it, that's fine, but you just got to say, this was generated by, or partially generated by, or initially generated by, or whatever. So I think the transparency and identifying what's already happening, and then looking at what are we afraid of? What are we really afraid of? Are we afraid that students are going to graduate and not know anything because they did everything on ChatGPT? Is that what we're afraid of? Are we afraid the faculty aren't going to do work anymore? They're just going to throw everything in some AI system and let it generate their syllabus and grade their papers and do everything else for them? We got to think about, what are we afraid of, and how can we best utilize the good things about this? And there's already been things written about how this really does help native language speakers, or people that are not native language speakers, for writing. How it helps them to become better writers. There are some positive things that come out of the use as well. Students have always cheated. They were cheating before ChatGPT ever came along. There's always ways. So what we got, I think, when we define that, and then define what it is we want that to look like, is the best way to start with a policy.
Thank you. That's an interesting answer. Now, we have another question from our audience from PK, which is, which level of learning outcomes, brackets revised Bloom's taxonomy, could be assessed effectively with AI? It's a very specific question. Would either of you be able to answer that?
Yeah. I can jump on that one if you
Okay.
want to. Okay.
Yes,
I
please.
think when we think about, if you're talking about the revised Bloom's taxonomy, it starts at the knowledge level and goes on up to the create level. So you start at the knowledge level, but you can use multiple choice, true and false tests to measure whether or not a student knows something and whether they understand it, right? Then when you come to analysis and say it gets a little more, it gets a little more complex. The you don't need AI. Most course management systems will allow you to put a quiz in and automatically grade it for true and false multiple choice tests. Now, if you're using second order multiple choice, which are scenario based, it can get at the higher levels, the evaluation analysis levels. But again, that I think that would be about where you would go to create piece. I'm not sure that you can assess creativity using AI because AI doesn't know anything about creativity in terms of knowing it when they see it, right? So evaluation may be the same. So you got to think about those that are the kinds of assessments that are done, and whether they're quantitative or qualitative is also makes a difference as well.
Thank you. Nigel, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think that really opens up a quite interesting question about what we mean by understanding and knowledge, because in my view, an AI tool doesn't have understanding. It predicts the next token that it's going to use. It doesn't really understand it. And that's why we can't attribute authorship to AI, because it doesn't have the capacity to say, yes, I wrote that, I understand it. I would agree with what Gloria says. I think you can use AI to a certain degree up to probably about the sort of the fourth level of Bloom's, which is analyze. It's certainly very good at analyzing data. I think once you start getting to the evaluation and the creativity stage, certainly at this point, it still really struggles with that. And if you look at the kind of outputs that you get when you ask it to evaluate or to create a new idea, a lot of the ideas are either unfeasible or they are just plain wrong. They can't, they don't actually answer the question that you're putting in. But I think that might get better, and that's perhaps where Craig's expertise in AI agents and self-determining routes to outcomes might have led us with that conversation.
Thank you. And another viewer asked the question: how good is AI in assessing workout problems in which the students are expected to show the steps to get to the final answer?
I think that depends on the complexity of the problem. And certainly as the AI tools are becoming more proficient, then they are starting to be able to show that reasoning with the newer models that are out there. When we first started using ChatGPT, you could say, what's 2 + 2? And it would say 4. And you would go, are you sure? I think it's 5. And go, actually, you're right, it's 5. And so you could trick it into giving you wrong answers. Or if you gave the same problems in ways that were a bit more convoluted, it would trip itself up. And there are still traits of that within the models. But I think, depending on what type of assessment you're looking at, then perhaps a GPT isn't, something like ChatGPT as a text-orientated output isn't the best use for that. If you need mathematical outputs, there are various tools out there that will show the workings for mathematical problems. I think if this question is more relating to the process side of it, I think it's, again, about trying to educate those students to be transparent and ethical about what they do. And if they graduate and they have offloaded everything to an AI and they go into the workplace where they can't do that, they're going to get fired very, very quickly, because they're not going to have the competencies they need in order to be able to use that job, to carry out that job. So I think it's really about, educating our students how to use these tools effectively and well, so that when they do graduate, they have got the competencies to use them. And we need to go to the marketplace. We need to go and ask the people that are employing our graduates, how do you expect these students to use AI, and how do we therefore support them to be effective, competent practitioners in the discipline that we are graduating them in?
Potential that it might also change the nature of the competencies. For example, that more emphasis will be put on creative thinking, critical thinking, complex problem solving. because at least at the program level, we think about, for example, critical thinking. We can assess critical thinking at in the first year, you know, but the applications that the student is applying critical thinking to are fairly simplistic. But as they go through the curriculum, those problems become more and more complex. Whereas in their first year, they might be having to design a mousetrap car, you know, something very simple. But they have to use certain critical thinking skills to be able to do that. But by the time they get to the fourth year, they're having to design very complex processes or build bridges or, you know, airplanes or whatever it is. So it's much more complex, although the mental model is the same over time. So I think that's also going to be a factor that we have to think about, because the same competency may not be the same, even though they look the same across the curriculum.
We have a sort of related question from Abdelhai. Can artificial intelligence help us assess high-order thinking skills such as critical and creative thinking? If the answer is yes, are there any programs that can be used for this purpose? So I'll just repeat that. Can artificial intelligence help us assess high-order thinking skills such as critical and creative thinking? And are there any programs that can be used for this purpose?
I can only speak of my own experience of a final year student project that we ran last year, assessing whether AI could write good science, whether it knew it could write good science, and the answer in brief is no. It dramatically overestimates how good it is compared to what a human marker would give the same output. So I think there's still a very long way to go before we can think about using AI in assessment and for feedback purposes. I think there's going to be a place for that. I think creating quick, generic style feedback that the students get at point of submission before they get more detailed feedback from the academic, possibly. But at this stage, I certainly wouldn't be relying on an AI tool to provide the feedback that you give to a student.
I wonder if also part of the problem is that, and you mentioned this earlier, Nigel, about the fact that the data that AI actually mines, you know, in order to come up with their answers, is biased in terms of its worldview, and so that, you know, for creative and critical thinking, I think that's a real danger. You know, it's just really critical that we understand how this thing works, you know, and I don't claim to understand it fully, but I understand it enough that it scares me in terms of trying to create new something, fill in the blank, right? So I think we have to be real careful about that.
And that's part of it, isn't it? It is very much a black box. You know, we can't see inside that box, and we don't know how these models are doing what they do. And I don't think some of the people who created them in the first place really understand how they're doing some of the things that they're doing now. So yeah, I mean that is somewhere where I think we need to have some much tighter regulations around how AIs can be developed and how they can be used. And that's not a discussion for today. That's a whole sort of policy level should be happening at government level. But I think that's what's going to have to happen to try and make it a more regulated sector.
That's the high stakes thing too, Nigel. How do you feel about that in terms of being a different approach to the use of AI and high stakes assessments versus the ones that are lower stakes assessments? Or creating processes and products.
Yeah, I think it's really, it depends what you're trying to assess, really, doesn't it? I mean, if you have a course or a program where the graduate has to have a certain level of knowledge in order to be able to go in and carry out that role, and there you can argue that there is a place for high stakes in-person assessments which shouldn't have any AI associated with them. If on the other hand, you're thinking about, well, I'm going to go into a sector where AI is used every day, then we should really be thinking about how we can use AI in those assessments to really make it authentic, and how we can most closely mimic what those students are going to be doing. In terms of like the high versus sort of low stakes assessments, I think for me, if it's a low stakes assessment or a formative assessment and an AI is used and the student actually learns from that and gains a better understanding of the way that they can use this tool, then that's a great thing. I think with the higher stakes assessments, it really depends what you want to assess. And if you don't want AI to be an influence on that, then we have to take steps to ensure that those assessments are secure, or we have to design better assessments that AI can be used with and still hit the same learning outcomes that you would want that student to have. I think that's really ultimately where we go. And that kind of feeds back to the Sydney model of 2 lanes of you can't use it or you can use it.
Thank you. We have another question from Niaz, who asks, is there any available model, mechanism or possibility in the near future for programs to conduct their mock visit through virtual and AI agent?
Can you explain what you mean by a mock visit? I'm not familiar with that term.
It doesn't actually say what it means by mock visit, so to be clear, perhaps we'll ask them to clarify in the text. Do you understand what a mock visit is, Gloria?
Well, when we're talking about ABET, we talk about mock visits. Those are usually accreditation visits that a program will have a team come in. It's not the real accrediting group, but it's a group of people that are going to come in and do a mock visit to give them feedback on their readiness for accreditation. I think that's probably what they mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a possibility of that happening through virtual and AI agents?
Well, it certainly does take the peer out of peer assessments, doesn't it? Accreditation is all about peer assessment, peer review, right? So I think we'd have to rethink philosophically about what accreditation is all about. So, yeah.
Yeah. And somebody else asked, do you think AI will be, Vinja asked, do you think AI will be able to create assessment for speaking tasks? What will the future look like in assessing speaking tasks?
It already can to a certain degree. You look at something like Google Notebook LM and the podcasts that it produces, then that is incredibly impressive in terms of what it can do in terms of being able to take a source that you provide it with and create a dialogue between 2 AI avatars, essentially. There are issues with it. Certainly, it imposes its own sense of bias on sources that you have. And if you're really clever and you've got a lot of time, you can take the outputs from those podcasts, feed it into another tool where you can change the voice, and you could, I guess, ultimately you could probably create your own AI avatar of yourself speaking as you do. And I think there's a guy called Danny Liu at Sydney who's done something like that to really demonstrate the competencies of AI at this point. But again, if you've got a speaking task which is in person, or if you've got a speaking task that's being carried out over something like Zoom or Teams or this platform, it does become a little bit harder because you can actually see the person in real time.
Thank you, Nigel. So I think there's still a lot of questions in Q&A, but I think we're beginning to run out of time. So I just wanted to say that I think I'd like to thank all participants for attending this webinar, for our speakers, for providing such rich and varied thoughts on so many quite disparate questions on the matter, on trends in AI. You've been bombarded with complete surprise questions and very adept at answering them, given the circumstances. And I think it just highlights something that is going on with this subject, that there is so much that we don't know, and so much that's going to happen that we don't know. that is really quite difficult to say where we are in terms of the trends, because I certainly have a feeling that everything's going to change quite quickly and quite a lot in future, and keeping up with it and keeping staff trained and students trained in how best to use it and keeping an eye on the ethical questions is going to be really difficult. Some of the questions we haven't had time to ask, for instance, are who certifies the teachers who teach AI, and that question of what policies should institutions come up with. Certainly this is something they really need to be thinking about now. If you're not already thinking about it, there are so many questions arising from AI that it's something that really university leaders need to address in quite a comprehensive way. I'll just drop in one final question, which will catch you all out, I think. Do you think, Benjamin says, do you think one day an AI could substitute a missing panelist?
Craig.
Unfortunately, the person who could most answer that is Craig. And I think what we might do is do a little video with him and send it to everyone afterwards if we possibly can, because he would have had fantastic contributions to make. He really does know this subject area. And if we possibly can, we will send you a little treat from Craig to all our viewers. But don't forget, we will be sending you a link to the video of the recording to the recording of the webinar to be able to listen to it, and you will be able to watch it on YouTube as well. So thank you very much indeed to Nigel, Gloria and Craig. And thank you especially to ABET for partnering with us in this webinar. This is the first in a series of UWN ABET webinars on a range of topics which will combine the high-level thinking that engages scholars with hands-on advice that will help them to navigate their work in higher education in times of uncertainty. And I think we can all see we're in times of uncertainty right now. And if you're not already University World readers and you would like what you've heard today, please sign up to our free email newsletters to hear about future sessions. You can do that via the form at the end of any of our articles on the website, and via a link that we have posted in chat, and via the page that you will see once this webinar has ended. So thank you everybody, and thank you to all our listeners. I hope you have enjoyed the discussion, and we look forward to you attending our next webinar, especially our next ABET UWN webinar. Thank you everybody.